Hi, this is Father Bill W. here in Austin, Texas, and welcome to another podcast episode. I am an Episcopal priest and have been in long-term recovery coming up on 50 years if I don't blow it, and website by the same name. And if you haven't done so, I'd encourage you to go and visit that. It's got a lot of helpful information on how to do the practice, and also has the events calendar for when we're going to be doing workshops. If you go to the website, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. We try to get those out every month or 6 weeks or so. Finally, I want to thank our donors who help keep the lights on here, giving us an opportunity to spread this message about two-way prayer and maybe some deeper aspects of recovery out to as many people in 12-step as we can do. So out of the way, welcome to another episode of the series we are doing on a book called Transformation by Robert A. Johnson's Understanding Levels of Particularly Masculine Consciousness that Johnson addresses, but pretty applicable to women who have fortitude and that sort of stuff. And there's plenty out there who can, I think, relate to it. Quick review. The series is titled Becoming Who We Were Always Meant to Be. So kind of keep that in mind, that this is Johnson studying the evolution of consciousness. And I'm approaching it in terms of how can this be helpful to us in understanding our own minds and how we are evolving and what the next level of evolution is. So Johnson states that there are three. The first is simple or two-dimensional consciousness, and we dealt with this in Don Quixote, and then Hamlet for complex or three-dimensional consciousness. And now we are moving into Faust, where he's going to present four-dimensional or enlightened consciousness, as he's calling it. And the play was written by Goethe over the course of some 60 years, I believe. It was really his life's work. And he was called the German Shakespeare. And his play offers us insight into this fourth dimension of consciousness that I think the big book references it in terms of we entered a fourth dimension of our existence. I don't know that he had Goethe in mind when Wilson wrote that, but I will give him some credit for it. And one that relies, the fourth dimension relies on the proper use of imagination. Imagination. So if you're doing two-way prayer and you're following my advice to use your imagination in your prayer life, then I think it may help us understand how it is we get unstuck from the Hamlet phase. So Johnson starts his chapter off with a quick review, and I'll do the same. He reminds us that, quote, Hamlet's basic error was his failure to incorporate his shadow or dark side into his working life. If Hamlet had been able to acknowledge as an ally the red blood of his instinctive nature, he would have shaken loose from his paralysis. Instead, he stayed poised between his two natures, ego and shadow, and died a tragic death. Faust picks up where Hamlet lost the battle and provides a solution for us to this most modern dilemma. Johnson continues, he finds his way out of this paralysis by interacting with his shadow, Mephistopheles, until each has been redeemed. The story of Faust, he says, is one of the great statements of optimism, hope, and redemption in Western literature. Faust is the story of a highly complex, intelligent man who must come to terms with his dark or shadow side. So there's the basic setup behind the story. And now let me welcome David B., my new friend from California, who has a depth of knowledge both about Faust and theater and also about 12-step recovery. And he's going to help us kind of work our way through this play. So welcome back, David. It's good to have you back.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. A little intimidated by Faust because it's such a massive contribution to literature, but I'm excited to get stuck in.
Well, we got through Hamlet, so what the hell, huh?
We did. One
on,
down,
on
one to
to
go.
tougher things.
Exactly.
So my first question, David, is that little description that Johnson gave, is that fairly accurate as a basic premise to the play?
I do think so, yes. It's worth saying that Johnson's particular brilliance is to kind of connect the end of Hamlet to the beginning of Faust. So
Yeah.
we talked about last time, Hamlet suffers and eventually condemned by his inability to take action. And actually, when Faust begins, we find a man in somewhat similar circumstances. That is to say, Faust is a college professor or scholar or academic who's tossing and turning at night, trying to find a deeper meaning to his life, but not actually able to do anything about it until the events of the play kind of kick things into motion. So sure enough, give it an act or so, and Faust is moving on from where Hamlet left off. But there really is a wonderful overhang between the two characters, and I think Johnson picked that up beautifully.
Yes, he starts off with that stuckness.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the description kind of goes like this: Faust is a middle-aged college professor who's reached the pinnacle of success in his life, but yet he finds himself alone, and he finds his life to be meaningless. I think it's the spiritual malady that many of us face. We overcome the addiction. Now what? So Johnson says, and this is a little curious. He says it's actually an inflation, a necessary condition for leaving two-dimensional consciousness. The spiritual malady, the kind of taking on more than one should. That's the inflationary character to it. It's like leaving the Garden of Eden, going out into the wilderness, but it's the necessary sin, if you will, of taking on godlike characteristics. Had we just stayed in the garden, just to follow that story for a second, we'd never have developed a consciousness. We're just innocent, stupid little babes, Thank God for the snake. It opens up the door to at least a three-dimensional consciousness. And anyway, so Faust knows that he's kind of into some dangerous stuff here. I guess his mind was always bothering him, so he kept a vial of poison hidden in his desk because if the pain got too intense, he was always going to have a way out. Pretty good setup, all right?
I think so.
Okay.
I do think that Faust is suffering from a condition that many of us must recognize, especially if we're in recovery, and that is the condition of yearning or the condition of desire. He's so powerfully driven by his will that is seeking something better than what he already has, that he strikes me as a character, fictional, yes, but one that we can all relate to, who doesn't have any gratitude. In actual fact, the life that he's currently living when we meet him has plenty of advantages. He has a good job, and he's certainly a well-educated man. So what does he have to be miserable about? Well, what he has to be miserable about is this sense that there's something greater that he hasn't quite put his finger on yet. And in that, I think we can see one of his great character defects, which I know that I recognize, and I bet you many of us do: grandiosity.
Right.
He really believes that if he can just take that extra step or two or three, that he will sort of ascend by force of his will to a more influential position in his life, and that way madness lies, right?
Yeah. He comes up with a better idea. Look out. Look out.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm going to do a fairly lengthy quote, but I think it gives us a nice introduction to digging deeper. This is Johnson. He's describing Faust's problem. He says, this is a terrible moment. He's arrived at a terrible moment in the life of an intelligent man. He now sees that his level of consciousness, his perspective on life, will not support him. He has explored discipline and self-consciousness only to find them a dead end. This exploration is absolutely essential in one's evolution. And the man who has not trodden that road is not eligible for the moment of despair that is also the moment of redemption and enlightenment. This, Johnson says, is the midlife crisis, the mute suffering of existential man, the dark night of the soul. This is the experience of the intelligent man, the heroic man, the one who has reached the goal of modern consciousness. This is what happens when you reach the top of the ladder, only to find that it was set up against the wrong wall. It is the very best man who suffers this Hamlet crisis. Lesser men take refuge in guilt at their inadequacy, or blame their environment, or find yet another set of windmills to vanquish. Anything but face the terror of seeing that three-dimensional consciousness is not bearable, no matter how finely developed it is. A fault of this magnitude cannot be repaired, but can be healed only by finding a whole new level of consciousness from which to function. It's a lot, but it's a brilliant description.
Yeah, he's really quite an extraordinary author, critic, and poet in many ways, Johnson.
Right.
A couple of thoughts spring to mind. One is that in a way, he's describing a version of rock bottom, right?
Exactly.
He's talking about what happens when everything is drained out.
But maybe rock bottom even after I've dealt with the particular addiction.
Indeed, exactly.
See?
It's a spiritual malaise.
Yes.
And actually, as you read that, and as I'm sort of mulling it over and thinking about the story of Faust, I do realize that Faust's yearning that we spoke of earlier, which wraps up many very human character defects, including pride and grandiosity, is nevertheless a yearning for something of another dimension.
Right.
And of course, he makes the mistake, certainly in a Christian universe, the terrible mistake of seeking that new experience via magic, as opposed to via the sort of conventional pathways of religion. At least initially, he takes that choice, and that's what gets him face to face with the devil. But it's still a kind of a laudable ambition or intention, which is to find out what lies beyond or beneath or on the other side of the secular experience. And just as we talked about last week, and it was so clear in so many of the podcasts that I listened to that you've shared before I met you, Bill, the addictive urging is a craving for something beyond the secular, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we see that. We almost see Faust's longing for something else through the frame of addiction, and they're kind of the same thing.
Very, very much so. Couldn't agree more. And the pain is unbearable. And this is an important point in the transformation process.
Yeah, Johnson seems to suggest that it has to reach a level of absolute intolerability for us to really earn the next step or the next stage of the journey, which that's kind of built into 12-step too, right?
It is, I personally believe there's a word that's missing from step one. It's all over the big book, but it's not in step one, and yet it is the essence of step one, and that is hopelessness. It's the crushing of the ego, the experience of hopelessness that is the preparation for moving to two, for being willing to take the journey, but it has to be the crushing of self.
Yeah. And I think all of the first part of Faust, I'll talk a bit more about this later, but since you mention it, is really about the untrammeled ego learning of its own limitations.
Exactly.
And to that extent,
that's what life is about, isn't it?
Oh God, no kidding, right? Tell me about it. Every single day.
Every single day, another lesson.
That's right.
Another lesson. And if it's a defeat, I'm ready to learn the lesson. If it's a success, an inflation, as Johnson points out, you're probably not going to learn the lesson.
Right, that's true. We
Yeah,
only really learn in discomfort. So.
that's it. That's it. Just when the pain is more than Faust can bear, and he's about to reach for the poison, he hears Easter music. A procession is passing along the street just by his house. And the music, Johnson said, saves him. He puts down the poison, goes outside, joins the parade. You might say he goes to a meeting. He leaves his thought life and just does, just acts, as we will get to.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
finds a community, actually. You're right about that.
Joins the community.
And I do think he's right-sized as well, because all by himself, those grandiose thoughts and the desire for him to sort of ascend by himself through the force of his will are dominating him. But when he hears that music, it's greater than he can ever be, and it brings him down to earth a little bit. And I think that's part of this moment of change in the play. Johnson points out that it doesn't last, and he kind of rewinds in a little while. But for a moment, yeah, when he hears the music, he goes outside, he dances with peasants, and he just kind of becomes a human being for a second.
And music is right brain. And he's a professor stuck in his left brain.
That's exactly right.
So it's the right brain that's going to save him. It's music and dance and literature and poetry and ceremony, as we will get to. Yeah. So this third dimensional consciousness, as we pointed out, is really painful. And later in the book, Johnson describes it beautifully. He says it is like boiling in the oil of transformation. I just love that image. Sometimes I'm out of the pot for a while, and then I can feel, oh, it's necessary for me to boil a bit more. So back in I go for more pain and suffering, but it's necessary to move to the next level. Johnson says something so beautiful. Several of his lines are, but this one I wanted to catch. If you can wait just a little longer, when you reach the terrible moment of the dark night of the soul, the Easter music will burst forth. Faust goes outside, dances with a young girl. It's enough to get him in touch with a four-dimensional world. And it kind of reminded me, as I was reading it, of Ebenezer Scrooge, kind of stuck in the Christmas Carol, in all of his grandiosity himself, but he gets blasted wide open to another reality. Hey, and here Johnson makes another one of his beautiful comments. He writes, Kafka once said, in a moment of anguish, that the second coming of Christ would happen the day after the end of the world. Oh, that hurts. This is also true of the moment of utter collapse in a man of three-dimensional consciousness, just before the first redemptive vision of four-dimensional consciousness breaks through. It is a holy place, but an exceedingly dangerous one. Suicide is common, and it is easy to slip into despair or the solace of madness. It is a high compliment that one should experience this existential anguish, but it is also a terrible danger. I used to go to my sponsor complaining about my internal state, and he would say, well, Bill, you're hurting in all the right areas.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. That's right. Yeah.
Well, this passage in particular, and actually much of Johnson's whole book, Transformation, reminds me of another great book of literary investigation and spiritual growth, and that's Iron John by Robert Bly. It's a great
Absolutely. Yes.
It's a glorious book. I think it's somewhat misunderstood because it gave birth to a movement which is very easily satirized as, guys ripping off their shirts and beating on their chest. But actually, the book is quite remarkable, and it takes a Grimm's fairy tale and it dissects it from the point of view of the mythic journey that actually a young man must take in order to grow. So there's some connections here. And Bly discusses this concept of the catastrophic fall that is actually a necessary part of the spiritual rebirth of a human being. that having accomplished, certain benchmarks in terms of either wealth or status or authority or whatever it might be, there are those who just collapse, probably through their own addictive urges, and kind of crash and burn. And it actually is it's a way station that many of us have to pass through. So it's comforting in a way, but the pain that has to be endured while it's happening is pretty severe. But nevertheless, I think it gives hope to anyone who's been in despair like that.
That's right. That's right. So Faust leaves the procession and goes back to work, which is a terrible mistake.
Yeah,
Yeah, because once this process has begun, there really is no going back.
right.
And that's the point, that and recovery, what they say, it can ruin your drinking or whatever the particular addiction may be. There is no going back. I mean, once you've, oh my God, but I can't go forward.
Yeah.
You
just reminded me, speaking of, aholics of all different kinds, Faust in a way is a kind of a workaholic. He spends all day sort of sweating away with his books and trying to learn and learn some more and learn some more. And in this moment, having had a release into a more four-dimensional experience, he then, which eventually runs its course, he then goes back to his workaholism and tries to do more and work harder and exert more willpower. So interesting moment.
And that's what Jung says. In the second half of life, the rules change.
Yeah, there you go.
First half of life, you build up an ego. Second half of life, the rule now is I must let go of the ego. Yeah. And get it right-sized. If I'm still at this age and I need the pats on the back or more bucks in the bank, I've missed the message. And no matter how much you get, it isn't gonna do it.
Yeah, boy, recognize that. That's
it, right? Yeah. So here he is, back at work, and now a little black poodle of all things comes into the room just before Faust can slam the door. And the poodle is alive. It's filled with energy. And Johnson says, Faust's shadow has now been made manifest, visible. And it's the shadow that shows up immediately after the holy vision. I thought it's not unlike Jesus with the story of the baptism. Baptized, Holy Spirit, holy, holy, holy. What happens? Immediately sent to meet the devil in the wilderness. Johnson says, it's a wonderful moment when the black poodle enters Faust's study. Faust has a shadow now through which God can touch him and redeem him in some very real ways. I wonder if our addictions aren't a way for God, for reality, the great reality, to touch us. They're a way of opening us to finding the freedom from our false selves. So
yeah, I think at the point when hopefully we all hear that God is calling, then we recognize that our defects contain our assets, but we need the key to open that, right? That doesn't come. We can't figure that out by ourselves. Really, we need recovery in the spirit of something greater than ourselves to open that up.
What Jung has taught me over the years is that every shadow element, every dark side of my personality has a gift within it. My job is to wrestle with the defect and find the gift. And I think the same is true if we will look at our addictions. What is it, and this is you were referencing earlier, what is it we were looking for there? It's that touch of the spiritual that we touched probably in youth and we're not ready to handle. It was too hot for us,
Somebody pointed out to me recently that inside the word torment is the word mentor, which is a fabulous way of, looking in shorthand at what happens as a consequence of addictive behaviors, as, everything that descends into torment. And then inside of that lies the mentoring path that can teach us where to go next. So
right. And so, so we'll follow the shadow.
Yeah.
The little poodle disappears behind a stove and emerges as Mephistopheles, His Majesty the Devil. All right. Ego and shadow now are going to meet. And the next section is titled, curiously, The Missing Energy, because that is what is contained in the shadow. There's energy, there's power. It's destructive. If it's let loose, unchanneled, it'll destroy you. But if it's channeled properly, it's going to redeem you. You know, and that's exactly what you were saying, David. That there's something there that calls to us. It's more. And the drinking, the drugging, or whatever the addiction, and this was William James, it internally is saying yes, 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 while another part of my mind is saying no, no, no. The yes is alive, the no is dead.
Right.
Yeah, how do I find the yes without killing myself?
Right. It's a question of integration, really, which is the story of this play.
That's it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating challenge for all of us.
Yeah. So Johnson writes, Mephistopheles announces himself as, quote, the part of the part which once was whole. That's a beautiful line. I am that part of you that once was whole, but no longer is. This hints, Johnson says, at the work that is to be the task of the rest of the story. Humanity's original wholeness must be restored and reinstated. This cannot be accomplished by going back to an earlier stage of consciousness. You must go forward from the Garden of Eden through the painful time of transformation to the heavenly Jerusalem, which is a symbol for the wholeness of man restored. And this is our invitation, I think, in recovery to finding that spiritual experience, having it ourselves. It ain't no easy deal, and you can look at it as growing up, maturation, which most of us want to put off. We want to go back to being childlike. Can't do it.
Right.
Well, we can be childlike, but you can't be a child.
No, exactly. And some of that's right in the sweet spot of Faust's dilemma, right? Because he knows he has to take action,
Right.
But in some ways his action is an overcorrection from inaction, insofar as initially those actions are opportunities for him to kind of let his ego run rampant in a way that rather resembles that of a child, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, and this is the painful time before we arrive at transformation. And there's a lot of destruction left in Faust's wake. He falls in love. He gets a girl pregnant, which at that time in that place was, you know, a highly problematic act before getting married or without getting married. Then the brother of that girl gets infuriated by Faust and he's dispensed with. And then Gretchen, who's the name of the young woman, goes into a terrible decline of her own, and she murders her own child, and then she expires herself. This, you know, a litany of catastrophic events that take place, which actually make for good drama. Let's not forget that.
Have to fill those theater seats.
Exactly. The audience wants to see stuff happen. But we're definitely on the downward slide in the first part of Faust, as the title character kind of learns, as I said earlier, the limits of what would happen if he was given free will, not free will, but just given willpower to make anything that he wanted.
Right. So the deal that they strike, Mephistopheles offers him, I think it's 24 years of restored youth.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Exactly.
Here's the thing. But I think unlike the original play, he says there is an escape clause. He says, see, the deal is it's selling your soul to the devil. You know, I mean, that's the name of the game. But there is an escape clause. And that is if at no time along the way, Faust says, linger, thou art fair, if he can avoid that, he'll get his soul back.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful description. Now that's different than the original. Is that right? And
Well, it's certainly different to the Christopher Marlowe play,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the Dr.
Hmm.
Faustus play, which basically sets up Faust with a sell-by date. You know, he can have however many years. I think it might still be 24,
Yeah,
after which he will go to hell. So
going to hell.
he just pays for it. But in this case, it's a kind of a temptation, which makes for quite a lot of dramatic suspense. Is Faust ever going to be so satisfied that he will utter the words, "Linger, thou art fair"? We don't know until, well, about 11 hours into the production.
We won't go that long, guys.
No, no, not in this podcast. Anyway, so yeah, it's a very delicate balance between him getting what he wants and him actually feeling the fullness of satisfaction, whatever that might be.
So he's given his youth, and then, as you started to describe, he's making a mess of things.
Yeah,
Eh?
absolutely.
Yeah. And Johnson says, in other words, if Faust can experience the unlived life of his youth, but not become attached to any part of it, he has gained his freedom. Okay. So,
Well, that's such a brilliant. I mean, that alone is that one line. I think could have us talking for hours on all of its connotations. But first of all, I think Johnson goes to great pains to point out that there is no way in reality to live the unlived part of your youth. It's just when it's gone, it's gone.
right.
So this fantasy is on a hiding to nothing to start with. But I love the phrase, but if he cannot become attached to any part of it, he is free. Because I don't think Johnson leans into this in particular, but non-attachment is, such an extraordinary concept that is part of many of, the great religious movements of the
Absolutely.
world. And it's
do not cling. I mean, that's the Buddhist phrase.
Exactly.
Don't cling to anything.
Yeah.
It comes along, let it come along. Enjoy it, but enjoy the pain when it comes along.
Right. So it's not just that we don't remain attached to pleasure, it's also that we mustn't remain attached to pain, which is, curiously enough, a harder job, I think.
Right.
Many addicts know.
Right.
We get attached to pain.
So Johnson now introduces the opposites. So he set up the thing. Here they go. They go off on their adventures, much like Don Quixote and his opposite, Sancho Panza, take off on their adventures to learn. They're very destructive. So off they go on their adventures, and they're a pair of opposites, and they make a mess of things. But Johnson comments, the tension between them alerts us to the most important lesson in Faust, that all of one must be redeemed. It's not a matter of the triumph of one part of oneself over another. The point is that opposites temper and restore each other rather than one overcoming the other. At the beginning of the relationship, Faust is weak, shy, frightened, and inept. Mephistopheles is ruthless and bold, without morality or ethics. At the end of the play, Faust has become strong, and Mephistopheles has learned to love. Such is the true transformation of a pair of opposites, tempering, not triumph. Wow.
Great word, isn't it? Tempering.
Oh my God, tempering.
It's a very chemical word. So
Mm-hmm.
I had this thought when reading that section, and I offer this lightheartedly. In the realms of a drama or a play, Goethe has had the great wisdom to create two characters, both of whom can go on their parallel journeys in order to accomplish the kind of integration that Johnson is writing about. I don't know about you, Bill, but in real life, I find that trying to do that by myself is not quite as easy. Integration is actually, I think, one of the most challenging experiences one could ever strive for, or surrender to is probably a better way of saying it.
Right. Because we are such a mixture of conflicting opposites.
Exactly. And yeah,
Uh,
and that's where Hamlet got stuck. And this is
right.
where Faust manages to go one step further in part two of the play.
Yeah.
But boy, yeah, it's deep stuff.
So Johnson now looks at some lessons that we can learn from part one before we get to two. And the first is the hungering of a middle-aged man for the youth that he missed. And he says, to take this yearning literally is to fall into the tragedy of Dr. Faust. There are not enough Adidas shoes, Hawaiian shirts, or exercise machines in the world to fill the middle-aged man's longing for his lost youth. But if the lost life and energy can't be found by going back, they can be found by going inward, by making them conscious. Johnson says the problem of meaninglessness and loneliness, the result of our unlived lives, can be made conscious. This, he says, is a painful task. Yes.
One that takes much time and quite a lot of restarts, right, in order to bring that.
Yeah, and in 12-step world, I'm going to get myself in a little trouble here, but I'm known for that. People tend to settle for less than what they really should be going after. And so it's like, well, I'm not drinking. Well, so what? Are you happy? Have you found peace? You know, can you live with yourself? Can you be alone? You know, no, I have to have this, I have to have that, I have to have it. You know, it's still ongoing.
Yeah, and I think one of the millions of amazing things about recovery is that we are asked to remember that it starts again every day, right? That we don't reach a goal and then remain there just because we earned it, but rather we have to start again the next day and the day after that.
And this is where when I first read that in the early days before AA kind of got going, when they were getting sober in the Oxford group, it was more important for them to experience prayer and meditation than it was to go to the meeting. Mm-hmm. You know, go inside and see who's there. You know,
sometimes I think that the sheer fact that there are 12 steps creates a kind of an ascending order, a deceptively ascending order of importance. So well, I'm on step 1, so I'm at the bottom, but when I get to step 12, I'll be at the top. But of course, that's complete nonsense. And then somebody pointed out to me that if you look at it more as a clock face, namely that, you know, the hands of our lives will just keep passing through all 12 steps, you know, give it time, we'll just keep going round and round and round. Then it kind of equalizes things a little bit and takes away the kind of hierarchy of numbers. Because on any given day, it could be any step that is going to help us get a foothold, you know?
Right. And I think I had a moment of clarity when I discovered that the steps do not lead up, they lead down.
There you go. There you go.
That was Jung's great line, those who haven't found God have not looked low enough.
That's just very Faustian of you, Bill.
Yeah, well, I keep going lower, so off we go. Johnson says, we can find an alternative interior environment for experiencing and integrating our lost youth in the realms of symbol, ceremony, art, and imagination. These languages exist apart from time and space. And he quotes George Bernard Shaw. There is no alternative in life to torture except fine art. Now there's a puzzler, but you're in theater. And this is why I want to call on you for that. Help us understand that something happens in the realm of art and music and poetry that gives us access to that which we had sought before, okay? But we wanted to hold it and grasp it. And now we can just appreciate it and not linger.
Yes. Well, actually, as when I first read that sentence from Bernard Shaw, I thought about the fact that art is innately compassionate because it extends understanding and empathy in all directions. But as you're talking, so I think that's true. But as you're talking now, I'm remembering that there's a very brilliant academic and artist by the name of Anne Bastings at the University of Wisconsin. And I attended a speech of hers once in which she proposed that in addition to shelter and food and fire, one of the original needs of the human species is wonder. The capacity to have all of our questions kind of, tapped out and put into the open.
Yes.
And that's why for some of us, it's national parks. And for others, it's snorkeling, and for others, it's art and going to the theater and going to museums. But in all cases, we're being sort of our wonder is being released and drawn out of us. So
going to a great cathedral,
exactly,
listening to a symphony,
exactly. All of these things, there's so much greater than ourselves that we can't help but to ask questions to try to bridge that gap, which might have been some of the original questions about God, I suppose. So that's what I wonder if Bernard Shaw wasn't talking about. The alternative to torture is wonder. One is, closed off and finite and cramped and painful, and the other is completely open and infinite and expansive and ultimately very rewarding.
That's right. That my first sponsor, who's a brilliant guy. I mean, he was so brilliant. He spent 11 years on Skid Row in his Hamlet phase, learning his lessons. But he had this phrase, limited conversions. And what he taught me was that so many people in 12-step recovery have but a limited conversion. They go part way. They deal with the particular addiction, but they stop the growing. They don't go into this deep transformation that I think is available through the process. But it's painful, and it takes watchfulness. It does. Yeah. Johnson concludes with a commentary that ought to be familiar, I think, to all of us in recovery. He writes, imagination and symbol make up a realm of experience in our interior lives where the ego is important, but not dominant. Inner work requires that the ego consent to a subordinate, but still important role. With inner work, you take part in a process in which every element of life, including the dark elements, has a place of dignity and worth. Without the ego, chaos would erupt. With the ego in control, you are blocked by the egocentricity that marred Faust in part 1. Further progress is not possible unless you realign your ego's place in your life. Jung described this moment of realignment as the relocation of the center of gravity of the personality. This process is so painful since it consists of dethroning the ego that it is rarely done.
Wow.
Yeah.
The salutary words, aren't they? And in some respects, and he mentions it explicitly, we're looking at the journey that Faust takes in part 1 of this 2-part play Incidentally, we mentioned briefly the Christopher Marlowe play, Dr.
Yeah.
Faustus, which came a couple of hundred years earlier. Really, Dr. Faustus, with a few plot lines switched out, just tells the story of part one of Goethe's Faust, and it sort of ends there with chronic despair as the outcome. But Goethe, over many years, as you said at the beginning, a period of many
60
decades,
years.
60 years,
Yeah.
he worked his way slowly but surely towards this second part, which we will discuss anon, where the balance shifts and some of this integration and realignment that you're referring to takes place. And I thought to offer this up, Bill, by way of a sort of parting thought. When we think of the word tragedy today, we often imagine some kind of grave and final event, an unfortunate death or something that transpires that will only ever live on in misfortune and in pain. And to a certain extent, Goethe's play, which is called Faust, a tragedy, satisfies that definition by the end of part one. We have a mother who's killed herself and her baby. We have a kind of a nihilistic vision of what it means to be in the shadow of one's ego. But by the end of part two, things have changed, and there's a different definition to the word tragedy, which it's worth just touching on as we sort of open up our minds to part two. In its original term, the original term tragedy comes from the Greek, which means goat song or song of the goat. And the reference to a goat is a reference to a sacrificial animal. So tragedy in its more classical sense means sacrifice, the sacrifice of something or someone or some entity for the greater good. And so it's going to be interesting to look at part two and to consider that notion of sacrifice, what gets sort of, broken open on the altar and released to the gods. And there are symbolic aspects of sacrifice, and there are literal aspects of it. But right now I'm thinking about the ego. If the ego were a goat, it gets its throat cut and all the blood goes out of it. And we can ascend to a higher level, which is what tragedy ultimately, in its classical meaning, is meant to do, bring us to another place.
Yeah.
So that's part of the journey ahead as we look into part two of this amazing play.
Yeah. So it's the experience of hopelessness with the opening to hope.
Exactly.
I mean, that's exactly what it is all about. So this is heavy stuff. And I thank you, David, for bringing your shovel to help us dig a little deeper into this. And I thank you for doing this. And I hope for you guys out there that this was opening maybe some helpful insights into what is going on inside of us. And it was kind of negative, heavy, tragic, if you will, but there is hope on the other side. So for God's sakes, come back next time.
Yeah, don't miss it. You got to finish.
I always wanted to end my first step lecture with, "You're all hopeless. Now, have a nice day." Because I wanted the patients to have that experience of hopelessness. Because unless you get crushed, you ain't gonna. It isn't gonna work. So life has a way of crushing us. It's what it's kind of designed to do, but it isn't hopeless at all. It's finding meaning and purpose within that, and that's a very, very beautiful thing. So thank you once again, David, and I'm glad you've signed on for next week's show. So we will find some hope, and we will go from there. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and keep in mind the tragedy that is going on in Ukraine as we record this. I mean, you talk about chaos and terror and madness in the world. It is to be seen in all of its destructiveness. So glory to Ukraine is my new theme. So thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.